are not able to attend and that would love to be able to review this webinar. So just an FYI on that. So Southern Wings, a partnership of state fish and wildlife agencies. So essentially, we're a program that helps create international collaboration for shared migratory birds across the full annual cycle. It was created in 2009, and since that time, we've had 40 US states participating. Those are the fish and wildlife agencies. And this map shows that some of them participate individually and some of them participate as groups. For example, we have the Pacific Flyway Council that pools money and supports a few projects together. But at the same time, some of those states, such as Arizona, for example, participate both through the Flyway and individually in certain projects. Those 40 states have contributed almost 3.6 million to conservation of shared species, 81 that were the focus of projects over since 2009 across 11 countries. So what do we try to do for the states? What we try to do is complement the investment that they're making in the US. So our states are working on all of these migratory birds that spend a certain amount of time in the US or migrate through the US. And we are a complement to that to try to bring their resources to bear on conservation actions and work across the hemisphere when, as we know, many of these birds are not in the US for much of the year. We try to offer the state agencies a really flexible, transparent process in which they can provide resources to some of these amazing projects. So some of you on the phone will not know all the details of this, the state agency folks will, but the funding options that states use to support these projects are fairly varied. State wildlife grants, Pittman-Robertson funds, taxes, license fees. And we also have a variety of mechanisms that we provide to move this money so that we can try to be as flexible and supportive as possible. So state agencies have regional associations where they might move funds, flyway councils, as I mentioned before, directly to partners on the ground or through a US-based NGO or foundation. And we've also worked with other partners like flyway councils and migratory bird joint ventures in the US. So the last thing I just wanted to say is one of the reasons I think the program has been successful and has had so much state participation is our amazing partners on the ground and the great work that they do and continue to do, and the fact that we try to be strategic about the conservation actions or really the projects we support. Our partners on the ground are the ones that decide how to implement the project, what to do, and we just try to make those connections between our states that have a strong biological connection with the work those partners are doing on the ground. And really happy to be part of this program. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. And with that brief introduction, I'd love to now introduce Nick, who is a founding member of the Colombian NGO Selva for the last 14 years. He has led the organization's migratory ecology program. Research interests are across a broad range of questions about migratory birds, but with a special focus on stopover behavior during migration and implications for the conservation of stopover sites, which is what we're going to focus on today through the Neotropical Flyways project. He also leads and participates in projects aimed at restoring and conserving habitats in Colombia and Central America, with a big emphasis on coffee growing landscapes that we know are important. So through the Neotropical Flyways project that we're going to hear about today, among others, Nick and Selva strive to build capacity in the Neotropics, providing grants, internships, training courses, and also supervising students. So Nick, we know you're busy and have an amazing work to do, but we appreciate your time today that you're spending with us. And I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you very much for this invitation this afternoon to present on this project. Really happy to see several friendly faces in the audience, and I'm really looking forward to being able to share this project with you all. There we go. So there's quite a lot I want to cover today, so I'm going to get on with it and work through each of these different parts of the project that I want to talk about. So I was going to begin just to giving some background. Why does this project exist? Why is it necessary? Then talk a bit about how the project works. It's important to emphasize it at this early stage that the project kind of has two components, the main one being more research focused, and then a secondary one that's kind of growing and developing as the research moves forward, which is more about on the ground action for the migratory birds that Deb's already mentioned. So after describing how the project works, I'm going to show a little bit of what we've learned so far. There's an awful lot of information that we've gathered now over the last 6 years, so I can't delve into all of it, but I wanted to give you a taster of the kind of information that is being generated by the project, and then talk relatively briefly about how some of that information is already being translated into action on the ground. And then I will talk about the benefits of investing in local capacity. So this is one of the missions of SELVA, the organization for which I work in Colombia, but also the project itself is really to try and build capacity for both research and conservation within the Neotropical region. We feel this is the way forward to really make a change on the ground throughout this region. And I'll finish up with just some next steps on the project as to what's going to happen this year and then hopefully in the coming years. So with that, I'll just dive into why this project came about. So I think many of you will be aware that across the board we are seeing declines in migratory birds, and as a group, long distance migratory land birds seem to have an even higher percentage of species that are in steep decline relative to other groups. So we're talking about species that are essentially going to be migrating to somewhere in South America. We also know that of all the stages of the annual life cycle, migration is the most vulnerable part of the life cycle of a bird. It's when birds experience high mortality rates, survival rates go down, which has now been shown in several studies on a variety of different species, from black-throated blue warblers to wood thrush. And so it's really a critical moment in the life cycle where that mortality can be influencing demographic processes and determining really the population trajectory of many of these species. And yet, despite the fact that this part of the annual life cycle is perhaps one of the most critical in determining the population trend of these species, we actually know remarkably little about the needs of these birds during migration, which may come as kind of some surprise with so many years of studying them. But we have a much better understanding of the routes birds are using, but we still don't really know what they actually need on migration. So from our point of view, from this project, to identify the needs on birds on migration, we need to understand how they migrate. And our perception as ornithologists as to how birds migrate has been evolving at a phenomenal rate over the last decade or so, with new tracking technologies and different ways of studying migratory birds. And for some time, we have known that the vast majority of any migratory journey is actually spent at what are termed stopover sites and not in flight. But what perhaps we hadn't realized in the past was that these stopover sites aren't as widespread as we once imagined. I think, an image that many people had in the past of how birds migrate is they take off from either their breeding or their wintering grounds, and then they'll kind of stop on a daily basis or every couple of days, and kind of feed up and continue migrating. And therefore kind of their needs on migration were always perceived as this very dispersed set of sites over a massive area. But the more and more we study migration, what we find is that even in land birds, they tend to use relatively discrete regions to stop over on migration and essentially gain the energy reserves they need to migrate. So what we're seeing now is this example on the right, for example, which is the veery, relatively common species throughout the eastern forests of the US. Any individual may typically use just 3 individual areas during migration to gain the fuel they need to migrate from somewhere like Delaware all the way down to the Amazon rainforest. So this completely changes the way we envisage migration, and also the way we can envisage actually ensuring that birds' needs are met on migration. And so the key point here is that these stopovers basically provide the energy for flights. And for successful migration, birds need energy. They can't fly 5,000, 10,000 kilometers on any given migration if they don't have the energy reserves to do that. So one of the major premises behind the Neotropical Flyways project is that if we want to conserve these species, we have to understand where that energy comes from. And when we take that question, we can actually break it down into a series of different layers or levels at which we can look at it. So, from the previous example, we understand that there are potentially these strategic stopover regions and fairly discrete areas along the length of their migration route that these birds might be using. So the step one is to try and identify them. But with any given region, there tends to be a lot of variation as to what you find on the ground in terms of ecosystems, in terms of habitats. So the next step is to kind of drill down a bit more and understand, where are these resource-rich habitats? Which are the habitats that are providing more food to these birds, and therefore they're keying in on them during migration? But then even within a habitat, things aren't uniform. There will be certain trees that provide more fruit to a species like the bay-breasted warbler you can see here munching away on some lovely berries. Or there may be trees that provide more insects. So we kind of need to go down to another level and actually identify, say, food plants, for example, that are providing these critical resources they need to actually fatten up for their migration. But what do we actually already know? Does this picture I'm painting kind of make sense? Well, our research, as Deb already mentioned, started around 14 years ago. And bit by bit, we've been piecing together this idea that yes, that you can find sites that are kind of critical to the success of a given migration for an individual or at the species level. And I think this example that I'm showing now of the grey-cheeked thrush is one of the most striking in terms of just kind of showing how fundamental one given stopover site or region can be in the migration of a given bird or species. So this graph on the left, you're going to see quite a few of these, so I'm just going to explain it briefly. What you're looking at is basically a series of birds that have been captured on one occasion, then recaptured again whilst on migration at the same site. And what you're seeing is the change in body mass over time. So on the x-axis, you just have number of days since the first capture to the second capture. And on the y-axis, some measure of body mass change. Sometimes it will be expressed in grams, sometimes it will be expressed as a percentage of like the normal body mass a bird can have. And so what you see, each of these individual points shows that the longer a bird stays at one of these stopover sites, its body mass is increasing. And what we found when we started working in the Santa Marta Mountains, or the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta of Colombia, back in 2010, was that during spring migration, tens of thousands of grey-cheeked thrushes key in on this mountain range from early April onwards. And as we were running mist nets, we just kept recatching individuals and starting to find that, yes, these individuals weren't just kind of arriving and moving on, but they were staying often for up to 2 weeks, and that they were making these massive increases in body mass. So here at the top end, you've got birds increasing their body mass by around 40%. So it's like me going from, say, 70 kilos up to 110 over the space of a couple of weeks. It's just, incredible increases in body mass. And when we found this, we thought, wow, what does that mean? Are these birds actually capable on leaving this stopover site of, say, they're making a direct flight up to the Gulf Coast or beyond? What's happening? So we kind of plugged these data into some models, and the suggestion was, yes, these birds on leaving this stopover site can essentially jump Central America or the Caribbean islands and just go and, one go all the way up to North America. Proving that was much more difficult, but this was kind of in the golden age of lots of different new ways of tracking migratory birds coming along. And one of the systems that happened to come along at the time when we were working with these grey-cheeked thrushes was MOTIS. So for those of you who have not heard of the MOTIS tracking system yet, it's basically a collaborative network of automated radio telemetry stations. So essentially you can put a radio tag on a bird in Colombia, and in theory, it will get picked up on these automated telemetry stations as it moves north up through North America. So when we first did this back in 2015, nobody had ever tried to use this system to track a bird from South America to North America. So it was kind of a big unknown. But the result from our first deployment of transmitters was outstanding. Several individuals were detected in North America, but not only detected, what was remarkable is that there were several individuals that are in this map on the right-hand side that, based on the distance they'd flown and the time it took them to do it, which is typically like 2.5 to 3 days, there was no physical way they could have actually stopped along the route. I.e., basically, they took a direct flight from the northern coast of Colombia, not only up to the Gulf Coast, but in several cases, way up into the Midwest and almost up into the Great Lakes region. And this, certainly for us, and I think for many in the world of migratory birds, was a real eye-opener, just the critical importance that any one stopover site can have in the migration of a given species. So, here in the case of grey-cheeked thrushes, they're covering up to 40% of their entire migratory route using the energy that they are accumulating in the Santa Marta Mountains. So it really kind of changes the way we start to think about, there are these discrete sites we can kind of identify and then think about ensuring that they exist for the birds in the future, rather than this vision of the resources being spread across, in a massive area all the way from South America to North America without any real way of kind of determining where you might focus conservation efforts on these stopover sites. The story didn't just stop there in the case of grey-cheeked thrushes, because when we first carried out surveys in Colombia under the Neotropical Flyways project, we basically didn't detect grey-cheeked thrushes outside of that area in the Santa Marta Mountains here in northern Colombia. And a study by another Selva researcher, Camila Gomez, who not only looked at the concentration of birds through surveys, but also using isotopic studies, genetic studies, basically suggests that pretty much the entire world population of grey-cheeked thrushes is keying in on this one area during spring migration prior to moving north. So this, again, really a justification behind the project of wanting to go out and try to identify these critical stopover sites within the Neotropical region. And another example of these kind of extreme bottlenecks that occur, which aren't necessarily what we thought would happen during migration, is some work we did in the Darien of Colombia. So the Darien is this very thin little strip of land that connects Colombia to Central America. It's obviously a natural bottleneck, but the big question was, does this actually funnel birds through this region from across North America? And what we found using stable isotope analysis of feathers collected from birds within this region was, yes, the likely origin based on the stable isotope signature in these feathers of birds moving through the area was from the length and breadth of the breeding range of these birds in North America. So what you're seeing on this map on the right is a composite of several species of where the likely origins of the individuals came from. So clearly there's kind of a concentration in these areas in yellow and red from the Great Lakes and the Boreal region kind of in Canada. But the likely origins span all the way from Nova Scotia across to Alaska. So really, a major bottleneck for migratory land birds, and not just, you know, a spatial bottleneck, but also temporal. So on the left here, what you're seeing is the timing of migration of a suite of species through this area. And we realize they're kind of all overlapping together. So it really suggests, you know, areas like these are also kind of fundamental in maintaining the migration systems we have in the Western Hemisphere. And something else we discovered was that not all habitats provide the same conditions to birds on stopovers. So we're back in the Santa Marta Mountains, but this time we're working with Tennessee warblers. And what we found, again, catching and recatching birds in two different habitats, the native forest that you find on that landscape and shade coffee, was that the rate at which birds could accumulate energy was far faster in forests, so here defined with the black squares, than it was in shade coffee, which is this line here. And not only could they fuel faster, they spent less time in the forest to be able to prepare themselves for migration before leaving than the birds in the shade coffee. So this immediately kind of rings alarm bells about, okay, so if we're losing forest, if the forest is being converted to coffee or being degraded into some other habitat, this could clearly have a major impact on the success of migration. Not only will it likely make migration slower, birds will take longer, but it could actually affect whether they survive or not the next leg of migration. And so when, you know, we remember that, you know, we're right here on the tip of northern Colombia, the only way north is across the sea. So what we actually did is we kind of converted the expected fuel load of these birds into a flight range. And what you find is that the birds leaving from forest can quite happily make it up to here in Central America, kind of the area within this green line, even up to the tip of Florida on having left from Colombia. But birds that were fueling in the shade coffee basically most likely only left with enough fuel to barely make it to the coast of Nicaragua or to, say, Jamaica or somewhere. So although we don't know the result of these birds migrating, there's the suggestion that if we modify habitats and there isn't enough food for the birds in these habitats to accumulate the necessary energy reserves, they may not make it on these crossings of open ocean, for example. So again, just another justification is why it's so important to start to understand where these sites are and how they're used. So hopefully with that introduction, I've convinced you that stopovers matter, that they are, you know, of critical importance to the whole hemispheric system of migration. And really that's, you know, where the Neotropical Flyways project was born back in 2016. And it started with a set of goals kind of based on that background I've just given you. One was to rapidly discover and map these stopover sites. So, you know, we are running out of time with a lot of these sites. They are being deforested, they are changing. And so we really need to understand where they are as soon as we possibly can. So we design methodologies to try and make that process as quick as possible. And then, you know, we don't need to peel off another level and look at, you know, which habitats are being used. Does the quality of any given habitat vary, and how are birds actually using these sites? What is the stopover behavior of individuals or species in these regions that have been identified? And then once we've kind of got those pieces of information, we start to understand which sites are particularly critical. We really wanted to kind of have parallel conservation strategies developing with the science and being implemented as soon as possible, knowing that, you know, the clock is ticking and we really need to act to make sure these stopover sites don't disappear. And then, as I'd already mentioned earlier, one of the other key goals was to build local capacity, both, you know, from in-country biologists, but also managers of sites, because they're the ones who are really going to do the work on the ground to protect these stopover sites in the future. So we really need to get that capacity on the ground early on. So how does the project work? Well, since 2016, we've essentially kind of been working our way up through a series of countries, starting in Colombia, moving up through Central America, and implementing a series of activities in each. So the way the project is designed, it works kind of on a set of modular research activities, which kind of helps, you know, makes it easier to fund, but also kind of roll out as the project develops. And essentially the idea in each country we work in is to kind of go down through those different levels I've explained already. So the first year is aimed at generating this kind of countrywide or region-wide idea of where birds are and what they're using. Just, you know, the most basic information, kind of where are they on the landscape. And we do that through a series of occupancy surveys. I'm going to explain a bit more about that coming up, just so you understand what that means. But essentially, it's going out and counting migratory birds over a lot of different survey points. Once that's completed, we then start to identify some of these regions that kind of stand out immediately based on the surveys and set up constant effort mist netting stations or migration monitoring stations to really start to understand, you know, not only there are birds there, but what are they doing? Are they gaining energy? Are they, you know, are they stopping over for more than a day? Those kind of questions that are really key to understanding, you know, what the function of any given area or stopover site that birds are using. And year 3 is kind of the same, but it gets more at that question as to, okay, they're using this area for stopover, but what happens next? How important is that site in the overall migratory strategy? So this is where, you know, these the Motus automated telemetry network comes in, and we're using radio telemetry Motus tags to track birds once they've left stopover sites and understand, you know, how a given stopover actually contributes to their overall migratory journey. So I'm going to start by diving into a little bit as how we carry out these occupancy surveys to give an idea of, you know, what's involved on the ground. So these surveys are aimed at surveying as the most representative set of sites or areas we can in a given country. So that, you know, these surveys are both spatially and temporally stratified, trying to cover the major gradients that you find within this region. And one of those gradients, which is absolutely critical, is rainfall. So basically, vegetation cover, habitats, the type of forest you encounter in many of these countries is dependent on rainfall. In areas in the tropics where you have low rainfall, essentially you find deserts or xeric scrub, and where you have high rainfall, you have, you know, super humid forests that many of us kind of associate with these areas. So the rainfall gradient is critical, and as you can see from this map, kind of northern Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica, there's a lot of variation in rainfall, and this creates a lot of variation in the habitats and the vegetation and the resources you find on the ground, going from deserts here on the Guajira Peninsula to super humid areas here on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica, for example. So each one of these black dots you can see on this map is one of our study sites across those 3 countries that I mentioned. We also sample as best we can the elevation gradient. So again, habitats change across elevations in mountains in the tropics quite dramatically, and birds respond to them very clearly, both resident and migratory birds. So we really try to sample that elevation gradient as well. And at each one of these study sites you're seeing on these maps, we set up a series of 100-meter long transects. Normally 8 to 16 per site, sometimes more, with a view to trying to sample as much of the variation with any of those given regions, whether it be in elevation or whether it be in the habitat types present on the ground. And just to give you a quick idea of what that looks like, you know, kind of the different areas we're surveying, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples from northern Colombia. And we're looking at an area that's no more than 100 miles long. So it just gives you an idea of the real variation that is in habitat in very small spaces. So the image here is taken in the Santa Marta Mountains. This is kind of pre-montane forest, relatively moist, but seasonal. And then we move about 50 miles to the west onto the Guajira Peninsula. Now we're in a lowland area where basically it's dominated by dry, thorny Caribbean scrub. So a remarkable difference between, you know, along a very small stretch of coast. And obviously, you know, birds have to choose or try and key in on which habitat they want within these highly diverse areas with strong precipitation gradients. And then moving just east of the Santa Marta Mountains, we have extensive areas of mangrove, which is again, you know, a very different type of habitat they may be using. So, you know, so really the surveys are aimed at serving as much of this variation that exists, but in an objective way. So not just keying in on where we know there are birds, but really trying to survey everything there is to understand what's not used and what is used. Aside the spatial stratification, there's also temporal stratification. Any of you who know a little bit about bird migration will know that it's pretty variable from one day to the next. Some birds migrate early in the season, some late, some in the middle. So it's really important to be surveying the entire migration season. So what we actually do in each one of those individual transects that I mentioned is we survey them up to 24 different times through the migration period in sets of 4 repetitions that are carried out in kind of each period of the migration to ensure that we're kind of uniformly sampling that temporal variation in when birds might be going through, and that red line and the blue line give an idea of possible different strategies which a species might use as they migrate through a region. Okay, so what can we learn from these surveys? What do we get once we've spent 2 months in the field with multiple observers spread across these landscapes, all gathering data simultaneously? Well, typically we end up with an awful lot of data. On average, we get somewhere between 10 to 15,000 records of migratory birds in a given season, and typically of somewhere between 50 and 80 land bird species. And all of this data goes straight into eBird. And often we have increased the number of lists in eBird by more than 100% for a given country. So it's a real kind of increase in the information available within these regions, just at the most basic level. But more interestingly, what we can do at a relatively simple level is just calculate an occupancy rate for each one of these sites. An occupancy rate is kind of essentially, a measure of abundance or the probability of a species occurring in any given point. But in our case, it actually acts quite nicely as a surrogate for the likelihood of a bird stopping over and the duration. So you can imagine if a bird stops one day and then disappears, the probability of finding that bird on the multiple repetitions of each transect we carry out is quite low. So the actual occupancy rate will also be low. But if a bird stops and stays for a couple of weeks, we're likely to actually detect a bird in the same point or the same transect on at least 8 occasions, if not more, and that will generate a high occupancy rate. So essentially, the occupancy rate should, in theory, vary depending on the duration and the way of stopovers and the way of birds are using any given site. So in this first example here of cerulean warblers during fall migration across Panama, Costa Rica, and Colombia, what we're seeing is just simply how that occupancy rate varies by site. The first thing we noticed is that the vast majority of sites, the occupancy rate is 0. Essentially, we did not detect any birds at those sites, despite multiple transects and multiple repetitions. And there are just a handful of sites, largely concentrated in Costa Rica along the Caribbean slope of the mountains in Costa Rica, where we're getting these higher occupancy rates that are approaching 1 for some of these sites. So this immediately gives us an idea of where this species is likely to be carrying out stopovers and where it's just simply passing through between successive nocturnal flights. So this is kind of information we can start to develop on a species by species basis. But when we have a lot more detections for any given species, we can take this a step further and make this so much more powerful. So here we're looking at Canada warblers during fall migration in that same region again. But what we've done this time is, instead of just calculating occupancy for each individual site, we have related the occupancy to a set of environmental variables, so to precipitation, elevation, amongst others, and then based on the top model, made a spatial prediction of that information to understand where occupancy rates are highest on the landscape, and therefore where we are most likely to find birds actually undertaking stopovers and laying down this, the energy they need for migration. And in the case of Canada warblers, it's remarkable that actually, the area they're using becomes much smaller when you look at it through this lens. So, the areas in yellow and red, particularly here in Costa Rica, these are the areas with high occupancy rates where there's a high probability that birds are actually making multi-day stopovers and laying down the energy reserves to continue to their wintering grounds throughout the tropical Andes of South America. And then you have these other areas in blue, which are more extensive, but really, there's no evidence that birds are stopping there. There's kind of, they're present occasionally, they get picked up, but there's no evidence that they're actually staying there because they have these very low occupancy rates. So you start to be able to kind of tease apart where, focal, steeply declining species that's of conservation concern, both in the US and Canada, where their stopover needs are across these large regions. But the next thing we can do with this information is not just focus on a single species, but think more at the community level. If we want to sustain these hemispheric-wide migration systems, we need to support areas that are used by multiple species. So here what we can do is generate these models for several species. In this case, we've used 20 different species during spring migration in Northern Colombia, and then overlay them to understand where there is the greatest concentration of species and individuals making stopovers within this region. And when you overlap them, is what you're seeing in this map, it suddenly really narrows down to a small set of areas that are kind of in either, in the brighter colors, the oranges and yellows and reds, where there's a high relative importance because you've got multiple species using them at the same time. So it really helps us to start to understand, where are these critical sites that are actually sustaining the migration of the community of migratory land birds that are leaving South America in this case. And what pops out here again, I've mentioned them a couple of times, the Santa Marta Mountains, we've already talked about them with gray-cheeked thrushes, but they're also important to other species. But also this area in northwestern Colombia seems to be critical. This is, again, the Darien region. It's a major bottleneck. We know a lot of species move up through here when they're going to and from South America. But what's interesting, I've overlaid the current Colombian protected area system on top of this. And while some areas here, for example, or the important areas are protected, there's a lot of areas that are not. So it immediately kind of highlights these areas that are going to be critical for conservation actions if we're going to sustain some of these really important stopover areas within Northern Colombia. So some of you, I'm sure, are asking, well, yeah, that's really cool, Nick, but do these surveys and these predictions actually relate to what birds are doing on the ground? Well, from my point of view, I can say yes, I think it does. We have quite a few examples where they kind of tie together. So the first one we've already seen earlier in this presentation, but that is that of gray-cheeked thrushes in Santa Marta, in the Santa Marta Mountains. So again, when we carried out these surveys across Northern Colombia, essentially very few birds were detected away from the Santa Marta Mountains, and with extremely low predicted occupancy rates were really the only area where there were high predicted occupancy rates were from the Santa Marta Mountains. And as I've already told you, we have this fantastic evidence showing that this is clearly a stopover site used by 2 weeks, for 2 weeks on average by most birds, and they're accumulating enough fuel there to make it all the way to North America in one flight. So that's kind of, ties in very nicely with the information we're getting from these occupancy models. Another example is yellow-billed cuckoo. This was very novel. Nobody was really aware that there was a major stopover of yellow-billed cuckoos along the Caribbean coast of Colombia before. It's in an area that's really interesting. It's an area that's kind of largely been ignored by the ornithological community. It's an area kind of a dry forest. It's been heavily degraded. There's no endemic species. It's kind of off the birding map or the ornithological map. But what we found during these surveys is that there are phenomenal numbers of yellow-billed cuckoos here. You can find up to 15 feeding just in one tree. It's outstanding. And so to work out whether, what these yellow-billed cuckoos were doing there and whether it's kind of agrees with the predictions from our occupancy models again, this case we had to use automated telemetry. It's very difficult to catch yellow-billed cuckoos. Recatch them is nigh on impossible. So the only way to kind of get an idea of how long they spend there was using telemetry. And what we found when we deployed these MOTIS tags that you can see on the back of this yellow-billed cuckoo on 25 birds is that, yes, birds were stopping over several days, on average 4.5 days, but quite a lot of variation. Some birds moved on quickly and some birds stayed up to 15 days. So still quite a lot to understand as to what's going on in that system, but again, kind of bore out the idea that, this regional approach to running these occupancy models does actually tell us something about the behavior of the birds. And I just want to take a brief stop there in those examples and just emphasize how novel this finding was, that these seasonal dry forests in Northern Colombia actually have a really important role in the migration of certain species. So for a lot of people who've worked in the tropics, they kind of ignore these dry forests for migratory birds because they're used by a very small community of birds during kind of the overwintering period, the stationary period. And so they haven't received much attention relative to, say, montane forests where, all these steeply declining species like golden winged warblers, cerulean warblers are, and so on. But what we've been finding is actually that a remarkable community of birds uses these dry forests, and basically because they are highly seasonal environments. So they're not all that dissimilar to the forests where these birds will be breeding across North America, in that they have very distinct seasons and they have a boom and bust in resources. And the interesting thing about Northern Colombia is that the wet season coincides exactly with the migration of birds heading north. So you can see as we run through these images from one of our study sites, this is kind of a silver pasture system used by yellow-billed cuckoos, among other species. We see an unbelievable change in the vegetation between the end of the dry season and when the rains kick in, which are actually surprisingly late in the year. I took this set of photos. And this radical change in the vegetation, just like across North America with the spring, brings a flush of resources, and this is what these birds are keying in on. There's a massive boom in resources that the local birds can't take advantage of, so it's great stopover habitat. The problem is that tropical dry forests of all ecosystems in the tropics have taken a major hit. In Colombia, there is just 8% of tropical dry forests left, so it's a really heavily affected system. So coming back to our other examples of whether the occupancy rates are related to stopover behavior, just going to come back briefly to the case of the cerulean warbler. Here, remember, we found these high occupancy rates on the Caribbean coast, on the Caribbean slope of the mountains that run through Costa Rica. And to understand what they're actually doing there, again, we had to basically deploy Motus transmitters and use automated telemetry, because much like yellow-billed cuckoos, they're difficult to catch and even more difficult to recatch. And what we found in this study was again kind of similar to the yellow-billed cuckoo. It confirmed the idea that where we find these high occupancy rates, birds are stopping over. And we were finding birds on average, we were getting a 6.8 days stopover, essentially a week. But a certain amount of variation, 3 to 15 days in those birds that were fitted with transmitters. And this is the first time that anybody has ever shown how long a cerulean warbler stops over anywhere on its migration, including in North America. So it's really novel information and phenomenal to kind of start to help us understand the needs of one of these priority species for many of the states across the US. And what's really exciting about this area in Costa Rica, not only is it being used by cerulean warblers, but there are several other species that are using it during fall migration to make massive gains in body mass to continue their migration. So again, the same kind of graphs we saw earlier, and yet they're almost all more impressive than some of the ones we saw. We're just seeing these kind of straight lines between points of whole populations of birds just increasing their body mass while they stop over in this region. And a variety of species from thrushes through to warblers to vireos. So really, being used by a whole community of birds to prepare for the next stage of their migration. And clearly, one of these critical regions where we need to start implementing actions on the ground. And so to transition to what I wanted to talk about next, which is exactly those actions on the ground, I just wanted to talk about the last level of information that we need before we start kind of implementing some of these strategies. And that's understanding what these birds are eating. So one way you can help birds on migration beyond just conserving these areas is to enhance them. So if we can make sure there is a lot of food on the landscape, it's a way that we can actually give these birds a boost during migration. So one of the activities we carry out during the project is foraging observations on individual birds, working out what they're eating. Do they eat insects? Do they eat fruit? But also relating their foraging behavior to the tree they're using. So in this example, we're looking again at yellow-billed cuckoos in the dry forest on spring migration. And we basically went around looking for yellow-billed cuckoos foraging, recorded the amount of time, the number of attacks they made on individual prey species, and did that for a bunch of different tree species. And we start to realize that there are certain tree species like this one, which are used much more than others and spend a lot more time in them, but also that they support higher foraging rates, i.e. they are finding more food relative to some where there's very little food. And this is critical information when we start thinking about implementing actions. And so one thing we've been doing parallel to these research activities is to set up native tree nurseries in some of the critical areas we've already identified across northern Colombia, so the map you saw earlier. But we don't just propagate any old tree. So the trees we are propagating and then planting on the landscape are trees that we have identified specifically as providing resources to these migratory birds, whether it be fruit or whether it be insects. And so, you know, we're not necessarily aiming to kind of create new forest patches, because that's often very difficult in these areas that are already largely private property and have already been heavily transformed, but instead work with landowners to actually enhance the landscapes where these birds are present by planting trees in different configurations to try and just get more habitat and more food on the landscape. And through those different programs in Colombia, we've managed to do quite a lot. I would like to see an awful lot more happen, because even though it sounds a lot when we talk about 10,000 trees or 11,000 trees, it's kind of a drop on the landscape, and we really need to scale these efforts up. But so far we've been working here at the base of the Guajira Peninsula, which we identified as a critical stopover area for blackpoll warblers post their transatlantic, trans-Caribbean flights during fall migration, and also for yellow-billed cuckoos. So we partnered with La Fundación Iguaraja there, set up a nursery, and so far we've planted around close to 12,000 trees, and are working on kind of developing a broader conservation corridor in the region. In the area where all the yellow-billed cuckoos are, we've been working with a lot of local landowners that largely manage cattle pastures to try and get more trees into those cattle pastures that provide benefits both to the cattle but also to birds. And we've also been kind of carrying out education activities in some of these areas in the northwest that have considerable security problems and are therefore very difficult to carry out broader scale projects, but education is one of the more viable options in these landscapes. Also in that area in Costa Rica, which we identified as being important for cerulean warblers among other species, with our partners, Ernesto Carman and Paz Irola from Proyecto Cerulia, we have started a conservation corridor called El Corredor Azul, basically the blue corridor, where we're trying to kind of connect up forest patches within the region and just get more trees on the landscape, particularly trees used by cerulean warblers. And Missouri has been, the state of Missouri has been a really important partner in getting those activities off the ground. And so the last piece I wanted to talk about in the project is the benefits of investing in local capacity. So as I mentioned, this is something we're really passionate about, and in each country where we've worked, we have taken on local observers, local ornithologists, bird watchers, to carry out the surveys and then be involved in each stage of the project, as opposed to a model where we just bring in a set of trained researchers from somewhere else and do all the work and kind of leave. And we really believe this is having an impact, because we're leaving capacity in each of these areas. We're leaving a passion for working with migratory birds, and essentially kind of creating champions for migratory birds in each of these areas where we're working. And I just want to mention two examples that I think kind of exemplify this strategy and how it has, this knock-on effect. So the first one is Carlos Gonzalez from Colombia. He was a local biologist trained in Cordoba in the northwest of the country. He came on the project to carry out surveys in that area where the yellow-billed cuckoos were. It was one of the first kind of projects like this he had worked on. And now he has been leading the restoration efforts, the tree nurseries, working with local communities, talking with farmers, convincing them that planting trees is good for them and good for the birds, and is generally just kind of growing into a leading figure in the conservation of his state or department, as we call them in Colombia. So just, one example of somebody who's really grown with a project and continues to contribute in a big way to the efforts in that region. And another example is Ernesto and Paz from Costa Rica. I've already mentioned them. They started off in the project carrying out surveys, kind of helping us set up the surveys in Costa Rica, but have since become a powerhouse for migratory bird research and conservation in Costa Rica. They have been single-handedly responsible for putting up at least 15 different MOTIS telemetry stations across Costa Rica and other parts of Central America. They're leading the conservation corridor, so just a phenomenal contribution from them. And so with that, I just wanted to mention the next steps. So this year, we will be carrying out surveys across southern Belize and northern Guatemala. We'll also be setting up one of these migration monitoring stations and mist netting stations in La Tigra National Park in Honduras, which is a really promising inland area for stopovers for a whole range of species. And one of the key elements that we're really kind of pushing for this year and next to get going is really crunching through the data and carrying out these priority settings. So, what I've showed you today from Northern Colombia is the first exercise we're doing, but we really need to move up through the other countries and get this exercise done for the other ones to get this information out there. And then parallel, but really kind of looking further down the line, at least over the next 5 years, is starting to translate, all this science and this priority setting into action. So expanding the conservation corridors we've already got going. So with that, I'll just say thank you to the huge number of people involved in this and the different partners and donors. I can't name them all, but I really want a special thanks to the Missouri Department of Conservation and the Wisconsin Natural Resources Foundation, whose unwavering support over the last 3 or 4 years has made a phenomenal difference to the success of this project. And I really can't thank particularly Sarah and Craig enough for their belief and in this project and supporting it. So thank you. And I don't know if I went over time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Nick. That was excellent. Really brilliant, the different pieces that we're learning. I mean, when I was looking at the report or the proposal talking about over 100 golden cheek warblers in La Tigra National Park, and kind of mind-blowing. So yes, thank you to all the states and others that have supported this. I have asked folks to put questions in the chat if they'd like us to talk about them now, even though I know we're about out of time, or we can get back to them with any answers to those questions after. And yes, Sarah, easy to support. Yeah, I would love to see some more conversation through Southern Wings on that piece you just wrapped up on how we can support data analysis, priority setting, and translating that into conservation action. I think that's something that the states could really get behind, and maybe we can start focusing on that piece in conversations moving forward within Southern Wings in particular. So I'm seeing a lot of support and thumbs up and great presentation in the chat, but I'm not seeing any questions right now. Other than, well, I guess Laura just put a question in. Do you have any idea of the amount of funds needed to move forward some of these pieces of the project? And I guess, Nick, I don't know if you have anything particular on the data analysis priority setting piece in the coming year to 3 years.
Yes, so as I mentioned, it's all kind of, based on these modules. So, we can put a rough value on each module depending on, the country where it'll be. So when we think about the surveys, it's typically somewhere between 15 to 20,000 to carry out the surveys across a country in a given season. Whereas a migration monitoring station, kind of the mist netting stations, typically work out, it's closer to 10,000 to run them for a season. In terms of the data analysis, it's kind of a little bit more difficult to put a figure on. It kind of depends on the model. What I've been trying to do, but haven't really had the resources to do so far, is train up people in each of the countries to carry out the analysis, so it doesn't all sit on my shoulders. Because I have become a bottleneck, unfortunately. So I'm really trying to get more people on board, and to kind of take on somebody with a master's from, say, Honduras or Colombia for a series of months. We're talking, typically around, I don't know, like $5,000 for them to work for 3 to 6 months, something along those lines, depending on experience. So, thinking if you kind of break it up country by country to run these analysis, that's, the kind of ballpark figure. But I think that some of the critical analysis we want to carry out really are unifying the data across the whole region.
Right.
Those are going to be the real eye openers, but there's still a lot to kind of tease apart at the local level, which is necessary as well. But hopefully that gives you kind of a rough idea of kind of the cost there.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone else was wondering if the foraging methodology information is published, in case someone wanted to try that in their own neck of the woods, if you will.
Unfortunately not. I will say that it's not the most kind of rigorous methodology to carry out. It's great in giving you an idea of what's happening, but the way we've been doing it so far doesn't necessarily give you something that's kind of publishable. With other work that we've been carrying out in coffee plantations, we've got a much more developed protocol that I could potentially share, which is a lot more time consuming. Basically means sitting and watching trees for 10 minutes at a time and going back again and again and again. So there's an awful lot of negative data. You sit there and not a single bird visits a tree, but it's the only real way to effectively kind of control for a bunch of different variables. But I'm happy to kind of share some of those ideas if there's interest. And there's a great paper that came out by Desiree Narango, who worked on foraging in coffee plantations during the winter, which is worth tracking down. I think it was like 2020 or 2021. Narango et al. Yeah, that's got a whole bunch of foraging stuff.
Great. Yeah. And I also, Sarah just mentioned in the chat, but I do love that capacity building piece that you guys are really emphasizing, and seeing all those faces and names of folks in Colombia and Panama and et cetera, just really, really impressive for long-term, right, conservation work, not just, the data you're collecting. Yeah, I love that part.
Yeah, it makes a phenomenal difference to the project, because you can project towards the future rather than just kind of going and getting the data and having some great maps. You actually feel like once you have the information, where to start on the ground. So it's kind of it's just such a valuable resource investing in these local individuals. Obviously, not all of them are going to stay the course, but there's always one or two in each of the countries we've worked who shine, and you realize you've just created yet another migratory bird freak who will continue to kind of carry that flag for years to come. So it's just it's both gratifying, but also you really feel like that's making an important impact, and we need to do so.
Excellent. I do see Sarah posted a paper in the chat on native plants, improve breeding and foraging habitat for insectivorous birds. So something that others may want to take a look at, but this, and Nick, we have started having a conversation about how this connects to the restoration going on, or that is planned to go on across the hemisphere through the Bonn Convention and other conventions that countries have signed up for. And I think that's another key piece, right? How does the information like what you're gathering inform where we need to do restoration that could be done through a larger partnership with other folks who maybe aren't focused on birds, but also wanting to ensure that they're not, they're restoring lands in the right way with native plants, so that we're not, creating sink habitats or other things where you have restoration. So you might get some, you might be able to get some carbon credits, but you're not getting a lot for wildlife and the people there that are living in those communities. So many good connections to be made, and yeah, just great work. Well, I don't have any more questions in the chat, and I know we're past time, but I just want to thank you so much. I learned a ton, and I thought I already knew a lot about the project, so that was amazing. So I will follow up with a recording and an email with more information on the project and some follow-up that we will share not only with the folks that attended, but more broadly with the conservation, the Southern Wings community, and the state Fish and Wildlife agencies. So thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Thank you. The chance to share all this.
Yes, it was really good. All right, I guess